So in this video, we're going to take a quick look at some of the attempts by Christian scholars, Christian theologians, to unpackage the idea of salvation, oftentimes thought of as atonement. So this, of course, comes from the readings of McGrath and his Basic Christian Theology book, the basic readings in that. So, a few things to note. First of all, this word that we use sometimes for atonement to describe the thing that is happening in Jesus in terms of the salvation that is offered by Him. This word atonement is really kind of the at one meant was created by William Tyndale because at the time that he was doing his translation into English of the Bible, the Greek word that he is trying to translate here later on is going to be understood in terms of reconciliation. But at the time, there's no English word for reconciliation. So he created this word atonement, and this thus has been used. So the Christian doctrine of atonement is describing Christian thought about the salvific benefits of Jesus' death. So what is it that God is providing for humans by means of Jesus' death or Jesus' life? What is occurring? So one of the first ones that McGrath points to is Rufinus of Aquileia, who coined the concept of Jesus' death as an entrapment. Almost he's thinking in terms of an analogy of like fishing and having a bait, and as it were, to try and trap the devil in order to take the bait. And the bait is Jesus, and the devil thought that he could kill Jesus. He sees Jesus as some kind of person that God has sent to be a spokesperson, a prophet, a righteous person. And the devil thinks that, okay, I can just swallow this guy up in death. I can, make things happen in the world so that this person is killed and so that we can stop his influences by God. But once he is dead, and as if, the devil can acquire, as it were, this person in the afterlife. What he doesn't know is that Jesus is also the incarnate Son of God, and so his immortality will not allow him to be dead, and so it's impossible for him to die, and so he breaks free, as it were, from the devil and breaks free from death. So he conquers both the devil and death through this means of entrapment. And so very kind of curious way of thinking about what Jesus' death does, but nevertheless, here is one kind of version of that. Then there's a Maximus the Confessor, and we see him coming here really into the end of the 6th into the 7th century. He's a Christian Neoplatonist, so acquiring, as it were, new ways of thinking about Plato and trying to merge those thoughts linked to Platonic ideas with Christian truths. And he focused atonement primarily in the concept of the incarnation itself. And so Jesus' salvation, by being incarnate, permits humans to be divinized. So it's this idea of us becoming immortal because he is immortal, because in Jesus the Word of God has become enfleshed, and so this now makes it possible for humans to become divinized. Now, it's not that humans become gods. We don't do that, but we share in the divine life. We kind of take on that divine life. We take on immortality because of Jesus. And so the benefit of his life, not just his death, the benefit of his actual presence in the world is providing that benefit. So we don't have to wait for the crucifixion. We get something of it already in the incarnation. Then we have Anselm of Canterbury. He's going to explain how it was possible for Jesus' death to provide forgiveness of sins. And so he imagines this kind of conversation, very Socratic in a lot of ways here, where he poses a question and he has this questioner responding in kind of banal responses. But he begins to explain that this death, what it does, it satisfies God's justice. In other words, human beings have sinned, and so according to God's justice, those sins should have consequences. Those sins should be punished, and the punishment should be death. And so God has to be satisfied. That has to happen. People have to die. But he has love for human beings. And so what is he going to do? He doesn't want to see human beings die and be annihilated and no longer kind of live with him, because the whole idea of the garden or creation is that God can, as it were, walk with or dwell with or live with, interact with human beings. And yet they have gone down this path of rebelling against him. And so some type of compensation for sin has to be made. And so through the death of Jesus, who's the righteous one, the perfect one, he's able to take that death and then use it for our account. And so this ends up satisfying God's, both his justice and his love. They are brought together. Then we jump up quite a bit, a couple of centuries here to the end of the 18th and beginning 19th century with Schleiermacher. And he proposed a kind of enlightened rational theory. So, within the Enlightenment, the whole idea of this mystical, otherworldly type of transaction that is happening, that the church was espousing, this idea that, like Anselm, that something is happening in this other world, is being rejected in the Enlightenment. They want things that appeal more to the rational in the senses. And so Schleiermacher is offering that, and by explaining the effects of Jesus' life and teaching, what it does is creates a redemptive community. So, for enlightened people, they can see a people, a group. They can understand governments and states. That's part of our reality, part of our world. But what Schleiermacher and the little essay that McGrath makes available, is illustrating one of the things that happens is we become conscious, as it were, for sin. We're conscious, as it were, of bad behavior. We're conscious, as it were, of things that are not right. But what we don't get in our communities is a consciousness of grace. And that's what Jesus, and through his life, actually provides for us, is an understanding of redemption, this understanding of grace that can be experienced in the midst of our brokenness. And so that's for Schleiermacher, is a way of thinking about salvation. We are being saved, as it were, from this consciousness of sin, so that we have now a consciousness of grace, which, more enlightened people can think of. I can see that as a benefit that's helpful for humanity. In other words, we don't have to be saved to go and live in another world up in the heavens, away from our body. Is something that we experience now in our community, in our life, and it is a community that surpasses, as it were, what is created by human beings. Then Bernard Lorgan, and so that's here in the 20th century, argued that the benefit of Jesus' death is intelligible. All right, so it is something that one can think about and one can explore with the mind. But he wanted to react against those who were proposing how to make sense of the way in which God is working in Jesus' death rationally. He thinks that putting too much trust in what we conceive of as rational deduction is not really the grounds of the intelligibility of what God has done. Instead, you can't understand it logically as divine necessity. In other words, God had to do this. As in other words, like with Anselm, God has a problem, and his problem is he's got to be just, and he's got love, and so it becomes necessary for God to save. Well, so for Lorgan, he's removing this idea that God is somehow in a fix. God is somehow has a problem internally. But rather, we can understand atonement if we think of it through a dialectical, in terms of engaging, as it were, in the language or conversation of Scripture, incarnationally, and certainly thinking about what has taken place with the, kind of an enfleshment of the idea of God's activity in Jesus, and recognizing that the whole concept of atonement is complex. And it has multiple explanations. So resisting the attempts, as some were, to try and narrow it down to one theory of atonement. Instead, to see that different theories, different explanations, different descriptions of atonement all are brought in together. And so, while there might be some sense in which there is a competingness of these different theories, and instead these theories kind of work together to make the idea of the atonement something that can be understood. Colin Gutton, more recently here, sought to center contemporary theological conversations on salvation to understanding the metaphors used in the New Testament. Now, he's reacting to the way theologians sometimes talked about theological language, such as atonement, and focus in on how our language works and looking at the structure of semantics. But for Gutton, what we need to appreciate is not the way in which our language functions, but the language, in particular the metaphors that are used in the New Testament. And understanding those metaphors and the intent of those metaphors helps us to have a more centered conversation about salvation, as opposed to where we might be led to when we just look at what our language of thinking about God's work might lead us to. And finally, McGrath provides an illustration from Rosemary Radford Ruther. Now, she's going to reject the notion of God, which is kind of the traditional view, of voluntarily taking on sin through Jesus' death to pay for what humans have done. In other words, this kind of satisfaction type of theory. For her, there's a problem with this whole theory, and that this traditional theory has kind of an odd irony about it. In one sense, humans should regard themselves as responsible for Christ's death. In other words, the reason why Christ came was because of our sin. So that looks like, he's coming as to help us out, which is a good thing. So grace occurs because we have been bad. And at the same time, we should endure just sufferings to be like Christ. So in other words, the unjust suffering of Christ is a bad thing, is a good thing for us, but it was a bad thing to occur. But yet we wanting to look at unjust suffering as something that we should take on for ourselves. And for her, that's a problem. And remember that Ruther is coming from a feminist perspective of looking at biblical theology and how it sometimes is done in ways that end up becoming more oppressive of other individuals, and particularly women. So for her, our language about atonement needs to be explored and reevaluated, because sometimes what we claim about what God is doing in the person of Jesus has a diverse effect, a negative effect, upon the way in which Christians live out, as it were, their faith. All right, so we'll end that quick little review of some of the theologies pointed out in McGrath's work.